Yeah, so because global ethics concerns with the global horizon of like various ethical issues around the world, so we need a universal standard. So if we were to talk about global ethics, then we need to have a universal set of standards, like ethical standards, to make a debate and to make a choice whether certain actions are right or wrong. But there is actually a question whether we can actually have a universalist standards of ethics. And as you might have known, there's a lot of discourses based on cultural relativism, which is against the universalist sort of argument. So that's why we have to see whether cultural relativism or universalism hold in which cases, and what kind of standards we can make out of all this kind of situations. So the core question, which says global ethics, starts with whether human beings share moral values and if morality is consistent across different times and places. So this is very important, that, I'm Korean and, like, are you Bangladesh, right? Yeah, so Bangladesh or like Uzbekistan, I mean, they all share like same values. Can we actually have same values? And like Korean, like I'm a Korean living in contemporary society, there might be like other Koreans who lived like 200 years ago. And can we actually have the same or at least similar moral standards? That's the core question of global ethics. So this is very important to think about. All right, so what does universalism say? Can you read? So as you can see, universalism argues that we can all have a shared standards of ethics across different times and different places. And that's why we can have a meaningful debate and discourse on certain actions. Like if you think about torture, or if you think about selling of body parts, all different like immoral actions, can we actually make a judgment whether this action is right or wrong? And if there is no universalist foundation, then it actually becomes impossible to make a decision whether certain action is right or wrong. So that's why people say that in order to have global ethics meaningful and meaningful, we need to have a universalist foundation. But there are various types of universalism. In many like traditional societies, the strong form of universalism is basically, religious belief. If you have a code of ethics within your religion, like within Islam, right? You set of like rules that you have to adhere to, and it basically says, God is willing for you to do this, or God think, it is a good thing to do as a Muslim to do this and that, This is a very strong form of universalism. And this form of religious universalism applies to all the members of the society or the culture. And there's a weaker form of universalism as well. So, and a weaker form basically insists that there are certain minimum rights and gradual sort of international convergence of code of ethics. So say there is a code of ethics which says torture is wrong. And some cultures might think that, oh, no, in certain cases it can be allowed, right? But in like other cultures, it basically says no whatsoever, right? And the international convergence basically means that, over time, through various international organizations' efforts, or like, such as UN, there's a convention of code of ethics. There's a convergence of ethics through various and consistent discussions on like different ethics. So within the universalism, it is important to acknowledge that there are like various types. So the strongest form of universalism is basically religious belief, and it basically says divine command ethics, and human rights ethics. It basically says that like all humans have divine rights, So we have to respect and we have to every single human being just because they're human beings. They're born as human beings. So human rights doctrine is a strong form of universalism, but we have a weaker form, which is basically advocating minimum rights for a certain group of people, and also gradual international convergence of code of ethics. So because universalism basically says that there are shared ethics and code of ethics across different times and places and people, so there are common vocabulary within the universalism, and we will actually learn about what the common vocabularies are in different ethical theories. So we're going to cover utilitarianism, it's a form of consequentialism, and also we talked about the virtue ethics, like Aristotle and like Plato, when they're talking about the virtues are the most fundamental forms or the fundamental values of the human beings or the good life, and universalism basically says that relativism doesn't really hold, because if you were to have a global ethics discussions, and if you were to have a relativistic perspective, then we can't actually talk about any actions, because everything can be relative to culture or the societies or the people. All right? Yeah, so what is cultural relativism? You read. Right, so cultural relativism basically says that all moral values, they can be changeable according to the norms of the culture. So say if you live in the Korean culture, there's sort of rules and norms that you have to adhere to, you have to respect, And if you live in the other country, they have a different sets of rules and norms that they have to respect and they have to adhere to. And we have different norms and values. So there isn't any absolute or universal set of rules or norms that you have to respect to. But if this holds, and basically there's no meaning in global ethics, because if we can't have any shared norms or values that we can actually talk about or we can actually adhere to, then there's no meaning in talking about it, right? So there's a big divide between universalism and cultural relativism. And this cultural relativism is quite a strong argument in many fields of society and globe. And you hear a lot of arguments based on cultural relativism. And it basically says the argument from difference basically says, we're going to read J.L. Mackey's example here. Can you read? It actually talks about the Greeks and the Colossians. Yeah, so this quote is from Herodotus. He's a very famous, he's I think one of the most famous historians in the world. And he spoke in histories. So he was talking about the history of the Greek people. And basically, when Darius is a famous king of Persia, Darius asked the Greeks whether they can eat the dead bodies of their parents. And they were crying, they were just astounded, oh, this is impossible. But when they actually went to talk with Colossae, I think he was one of the tribes over there, and they had a custom. They actually ate the dead bodies of their parents as a sign of respect, And they asked them, oh, can you actually burn, your parents' bodies, dead bodies? And they were just horrified. It basically shows how different the cultures are. And what would you actually say? Yeah, so it's basically showing the example of cultural relativism. And actually, if you think about the cultural relativism, can the Greeks and Colossians, can they talk about their customs? Can they argue which is right or wrong?
They actually can, I think they cannot talk about which is right and wrong, which was they are born with, they are used to, that will be right to them always. That will be the case here.
But I think the global ethics, or the people who are working on the global ethics, they're trying to go further. Because as you say, the Greeks and Colossians, they will just say, oh, it's just the way it has been here, so we can't really change. But global ethics is basically trying to come in and then tell them, no. There's a set of standards that all human beings, whether you're Greeks or Colossians, have to adhere to. And let's talk about what they are. I think that's what the global ethicists or the universalists are trying to tell.
There will be a case for now. It was like a long time ago.
Which do you think is better?
No,
All right. Okay, the argument from difference. Yeah, so this is basically the logic here.
so number one is culture X both the action is morally permissible.
Mhm.
Culture Y, the action is morally permissible.
Mm.
So number two is therefore cultures have demonstrably different moral codes.
Mm.
Thus, from number two, judgments about the moral rightness or wrongness of actions are expressions of conventions and norms that vary between cultures. So, from number three, action cannot be judged either morally right or morally wrong from an objective, universal, non-culturally contextual perspective.
Yeah,
Therefore, there is no object or universal moral truth.
yeah.
Action could be any action about which cultures is agreed. If it helps to understand the argument, substitute examples of action such as abortion, slavery, conspicuous consumption, torture, adultery, pornography, death, lying, bribery, or masturbation.
Yeah, so it basically talks about the logic behind the cultural relativism. Because it basically says that, like, if certain action is morally impermissible, and, like the other culture says, is it permissible? So they have, like, two different moral codes. And, as a result of it, they basically have to say that, the judgments about the moral rightness or wrongness of a certain action are just the expressions of their cultures, so you can't actually make a judgment whether action is, either morally right or wrong, So therefore there is no objective, universal, or culturally not dependent perspective. And this is very, very important to remember, this logic, because it's used very often in a lot of arguments. And we'll see how this logic is applied in various contexts. But there are some advantages to cultural relativism. Okay? Right, so cultural relativism has many advantages, and I think that's why it's used a lot, It sounds very tolerant. And like, okay, this is the way you've done in your culture, so let's respect it. And it sounds very tolerant and respectful, towards the differences that different cultures have. And I think in many Western societies, they are adapting the cultural relativism because of the many of the historical peoples they have committed. The Western people, they have been they have been imperialists. They've colonized so many different countries. And as a remorse of their historical sort of past, they are adapting this cultural relativism because they want to sort of deny that they have been imperialists or colonists. So it's like you have committed many sins. As an imperialist by colonizing so many different countries, and afterwards you're sort of trying to deny your own peoples in the past by saying that, okay, let's adopt cultural relativism, let's just respect, your culture, I've colonized you, but I'll respect your culture now, despite the past. So that's why there's a lot of discourse on cultural relativism in the West, especially these days. And also, and I think the cultural relativism, it has evolved into personal relativism these days. Yeah, so like people commonly say these days, I respect your opinion, it's the way you are, like, so let's just respect, each other. I don't really care, as long as you think that way, oh, it's fine, you know, and that's a form of relativism, you know. You have your own set of norms and, you know, rules that you adhere to. I have my own rules and norms that I adhere to, and that's not interfering with each other, you know. And it's actually against the principles of the global ethics, because global ethics basically say that there is a global universalist principles and values that, you know, all people have to sort of respect, at least respect or adhere to. But cultural relativism, it basically denies on the cultural level, and these days actually goes down to personal relativism. And there is a lot, I mean, if you see the commercials and, like, you know, TV, there are a lot of courses on the TV are basically personal relativism. But there are a lot more problems in cultural relativism. Right. So if you think about it, I mean, we've talked about, I mean, we've basically discussed that, you know, like if you were to have the cultural relativism right, then it's basically impossible or inconsistent to have a set of rules applied everywhere, right? So universalism basically becomes illogical, you know, so you either have to adhere to cultural relativism or universalism. And, but we'll delve into this in more detail later in the next page, but cultural relativism is in a way a form of imperialism. So if you say that cultural relativism is right, then basically you are saying that, oh, okay, there's no universal or there's no common values that people share. So it's a form of imperialism as well, because you're imposing other people, you know, what they have to think. And this is discussed a lot in the US and especially in North America these days. You've heard about the term politically correct, PC. No? So it's basically say in the US, if you say like, there are certain way that you have to say, you know, if you say homosexuality should be respected in the US. So if you say, oh, the gays are like very dirty, you know, like this kind of expression are banned because they are not politically correct. Yeah, and also like, you know, certain racial expressions, like many black people are very lazy. This kind of like expression is banned because it's politically it's not politically correct. So that's why the politically correct expressions are very important. But this has gone into extreme. So it has actually banned people from expressing their opinions. You know, some people think that, like, you know, his black friend might be lazy. You know, and then they can say, oh, he's very lazy. You know, it's an expression of a personal expression, but they're accused of saying this because it's perceived as politically incorrect. So there's a lot of discourses on cultural relativism, and it has gone too far as to become too extreme and imperialist. So that's why it's called cultural moral imperialism. Yeah, and also, I mean, cultural relativism, it sounds very tolerant, but on the other side of the coin, it's actually not very tolerant because it actually rejects that there is an objective truth. So if you were to think in depth, then it actually becomes apparent that it's not as tolerant, you know. So there are certain actions which people think, like racism, like murder, or like torture, or there are certain actions which people think that they are essentially wrong, you know. But according to like cultural relativism, there are no essentially wrong actions because they all depend on different cultures. So there is a practical limitation in that, you know, because different societies or cultures might have like different views on like certain actions, and there is no universal truth or objective truth on, or the values that all people must adhere to, then all these like seemingly very essentially wrong acts like murder, like torture, or like theft, they become big. In some, depending on some context or some cultures, they can be actually right. So this is the pitfall of the moral relativism. Yeah, and then also because there's so much global integration these days, like the world is so much connected these days. There are all this communication going on, SNS and the internet. Like if there's a big incident in Iraq, then people can just upload their videos, and then people can instantly have an access to it. And there's so much like more global network these days. So I think it actually has become more impossible to accept the moral or the cultural relativism. Yeah, so this is the fundamental sort of problem of the cultural relativism. Yeah, so I've repeatedly emphasized the fact that if cultural relativism holds, then universalism or the discourse of global ethics doesn't hold. So which means that it's almost impossible to discuss about the issues in global ethics if cultural relativism holds. Yeah. Then it basically entails a lack of debate, and also if you say that, oh, okay, so murder is wrong, what are the ways that we can improve the situation? And cultural relativist comes in, and then he or she says, oh, in Korea, this is the way it's been. This is the way it's been here. This is the way it's been conducted in here. So why don't you respect the culture here? Then afterwards, the discussion ends, and we can't really have a solution, or we can't have a productive discussion as to how to improve the situation. So I think in the first sort of last lecture, I've emphasized that one of the great characteristics of global ethics is on practice. A lot of global ethicists, they not only emphasize theories, but they try to implement their beliefs and theories into practice by having the policy made, or like all this kind of stuff. But cultural relativism, if they come in and then they say, oh, there's no way that we can, negate the practices in this culture, then we can't really have a productive discussion. And also, we can't really implement a new policy or new practices because, basically the discussion ends here. So that's why it's very important to have that sort of angle that cultural relativism is very bad for the development of the global ethics. Yeah, so basically so far we've discussed the universalist versus cultural relativist point of view, right? And you now know that for global ethics to hold, then we need a universalist position, right? And there are various theories within the universalist position. And universalism basically says that there are shared values and shared norms across like different societies, like times and people, right? And it's a moral code or a moral theory applies to everyone across different times, right? And there are various strands within the universalism, and one of the big strands in universalism is consequentialism. And consequentialism is basically a moral theory based on the consequences of certain action. And within the consequentialism, the most famous theory is utilitarianism. Have you heard about utilitarianism? All right, okay. So let's have a look at the utilitarianism. Right. So utilitarianism, you will hear a lot of arguments based on utilitarianism. So it's very important to remember what utilitarianism is. Utilitarianism is. So when you think about utilitarianism, you have to think about utility. What do you mean by utility? Yeah, so utility is basically use or the function. Yeah. So utilitarianism basically says this was a very radical thought, if you have to think about it, because this was developed around, at the beginning of the 1800s, and at that time, it was a very much sort of feudal society. So if you were to think a boy born in the aristocratic family and a boy born in peasant family, you know, are they worth the same? No, not at all. Even now, you know, they don't work the same, like in many ways. But this theory basically says everybody to count for one, and nobody for more than one. So it basically says the boy born in the aristocratic family just counts for one, and the boy born in poor peasant family to count for one. So they are basically equally the same. So this was a very, very sort of radical, revolutionary thought at that time. And utilitarianism basically says the morally best solution or action is to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. And here, the greatest number counts everybody as equally one, right? So if a certain action increases the overall happiness of a set of a member of a society, members of the society, then it becomes morally right. So this was radical in that way. And basically, impartiality principle says there's no special treatment based on a person's status, power, or distance. Basically means like, you know, like distance, like family, whether the person is family member or relative or like, you know, same, I don't know, like say neighborhood, you know, like distance means this. So no, like, yeah. It's basically all human beings, everybody is to be counted for one. And the morally right action basically is calculated based on the greatest happiness one person can have or a set of people can have within the community. So this is very important to remember, and that's why it's called as a strand of a theory of consequentialism, because it only sees the outcome. It doesn't see the process. It sees the consequences of a certain action. And it evaluates the consequences or the outcomes of a certain action based on the overall happiness that action creates. Yeah, so Bentham was the first person who created the utilitarian principle. There are like a lot of others who sort of followed his footsteps and sort of recreated the utilitarianism, but he was the forefather of the utilitarianism, or original creator. So what do you mean by maximizing pleasure, according to Bentham? Can you read? Yeah. So Bentham was the original creator of utilitarianism, and basically Bentham says that, you know, morality is all about maximizing pleasure. So he equates the happiness as pleasure. So he thinks morality is basically maximize pleasure. And pleasure basically counted as pleasure minus pain is happiness. And this is basically maximizing happiness is basically a morally good action. So it sounds very simple, isn't it? So if certain action is maximizing your pleasure, and you basically have to find an action which, which gives you the maximum pleasure and basically minimizes your pain. So when we evaluate, like whether action A is right or action A is better than B, we basically have to see whether action A has more pleasure than pain. Yeah. So it sounds very simple, and that's one of the advantages that this utilitarianism has, but it actually is more complicated than it sounds. Yeah. So it sounds very simple, it's maximizing the pleasure and minimizing the pain. But Mila was asking, as you are asking, so what do you mean by the pleasure? What do you think pleasure is? That's good. But people have different ideas on like what pleasure is. Some people might think having a lot of chocolates is a pleasure. But my husband doesn't like chocolate, so he says, oh, no, it's not a pleasure. But for him, reading a lot of books is a pleasure. Yeah, having a lot of money for some is a great pleasure, right? Yeah. But for some, pleasure might be, so that's why he said Mill. So Bentham, Mill's father was a great friend of Bentham. So Bentham, they took walks a lot together. I think they were having a lot of discussion amongst themselves. And Mill was basically asking, what do you mean by pleasure here? Because he says a human being is better than pig, Pig they eat a lot, they eat, so for pig, eating is their maximum pleasure. But human beings, eating is a part of pleasure, but it's not everything, right? So human beings have a lot of different pleasures, and basically he says Socrates might have been like, poor in a sense that, like materially poor, but he's better. He's more morally, he had a morally better life in a way, even according to the utilitarian perspective, than a fool, because he had a higher sort of goals of life, and he had disciples, and he had, like very grand philosophies about, the way of life and stuff like that. So from Mill's perspective, pleasure not only entails like material pleasure or material well-being, but more of like a mental or philosophical well-being. So he was basically posing that there are like qualitative different types of pleasure. And we have to basically think what those different types of pleasure are, and we have to make a value judgment whether this pleasure is better than the other type of pleasure. Do you agree with it? So he basically says, and even afterwards, different theories propose different kinds of happiness. What do you mean by happiness here? What do you mean by pleasure here? So there are different theories on what happiness constitutes. So,
mental state, feeling happy,
mm-hmm.
desire satisfaction, getting what you want, or object, having what you need.
Yeah, so like there are three different theories on what happiness constitutes. A mental state theory basically is happiness is about feeling happy. And desire satisfaction theory basically says, oh, happiness is about getting what you want. And objectiveness theory basically says, oh, happiness is having what you need. Yes, and we're going to see in detail what those theories are. Alright, so happiness as feeling happy. Right, so if you were to define happiness as feeling happy, what would that entail? And Robert Nozick is a very famous philosopher, and he basically gave us an example of a thought experiment. It's an experiment that is conducted in thought, and it says it's talking about experience machine. And we're going to have a look at the quote in the next page, okay? But have you ever read Brave New World or watched the Matrix? It's a movie.
Yeah, I saw that.
Oh, you saw the Matrix, right? So, in the Brave New World, basically they have a pill. If you just have the pill, then it makes you instantly feel very happy.
Both kind of said the movie and the book, maybe they both offer two pills.
Oh, right. Oh, Matrix, they offer the pill as well?
Yeah, I think pill is from the Matrix.
All right. Brave New World, the government offers people some pills to make them happy. Yeah. Right. And if you just have the pill, then it makes you feel happy instantly. And according to the utilitarian theory, basically, if the morality is about maximizing happiness, the more you take the pills to make you happy, basically it's a morally right action. But it feels a bit suspicious, like, oh, that's a bit weird, So we could see that it's not right. And basically in Nozick, he proposed this thought experiment of experience machine. Can you read?
Nozick's experience.
What do you think? Would you plug in? But I think it's actually, it gives a lot of insights into the digital world. Yeah. Because a lot of people spend so much time in digital world these days. Yeah, it's similar in a way, So like what the philosopher's talking about, even the Brave World and the Matrix, it sounds really horrible, but it's actually happening these days. Yeah.
It's easier to just let the machine or everything else do the works for you than doing it yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the reason for it.
So if you say that like happiness is about like feeling happy, then it just doesn't count,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who gets you happy, just you feel happy.
Right. Okay, so the second theory is basically happiness is about getting what you want. Yeah, so this utilitarian theory is used a lot by economists. A lot of economists, their philosophical foundation is on utilitarianism. You spotted it. And basically, it says, happiness is about what you, getting what you want, acquiring what you desire, right? And most of the time, it's the indicators for this is based on money, this is good, and I think this holds for some, but then there are problems within this theory as well, because if you were to just focus on the money or the immediate satisfaction of your desire, then many times you can actually disregard the long-term consequences, of your desire. And sometimes what you desire now might change later, right? So there are like time differences, like your desire might change over time, and also what you desire now is not very good, from the inside. You will actually regret that you have desired that thing at that time, So basically what it points out is that it makes you very short-sighted. If you were to focus on the desire satisfaction, it makes you very short-sighted, and it basically ignores the long-term perspective. Yeah. So although this holds for a lot of economists, if you were to just focus on too much the economics or the money side or the desire satisfaction side, it basically makes you short-sighted and sort of ignore the long-term perspective of the life. And the third variation is basically says happiness is getting what you need. So there's a difference. You're getting what you desire versus getting what you need. Right. So it basically says, happiness is about getting what you need, right? But how do you decide what you need? A lot of times people really don't know what they need, right? So it basically builds on Mill's differentiation between like higher pleasure and lower pleasure. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So there are higher pleasures which are like, what do you think the examples of the higher pleasures?
Having fancy things like doing what others cannot actually do, easily do. Having high status and rules in the society.
I think there is more value on the immaterial sort of side, what Mill emphasizes. Because Mill says that like Socrates is basically better than a fat, rich. That's what it says. So I think Mill emphasized more on that sort of mental or the philosophical achievement, or the intellectual achievement. But people can have like different values on what constitutes a better or the worse pleasure, So it's very difficult to decide which actually are the better or the higher pleasure and which are the lower or the worse pleasure. And according to this theory, basically philosophers or other sort of intellectually more given people can decide what they need, what people need. And there's a mention of Martha Nussbaum. She's a famous philosopher based in Chicago University. She proposed this capability approach. And capability approach basically, within the field of developmental studies, it basically says in developing countries, people need certain set of goods and certain set of principles to thrive, And she actually gave a list of a certain goods or the principles that people need to adhere to in order to develop more prospering. But this is a set of objective principles or the rules that are given by someone else. It's not what you determine or it's not what I determine, but a third person who determines the set of pleasure, a set of the list of pleasures. So there can be problematic, because a third person decides which is better for you, right? Yeah, so these are the three theories that basically talks about what constitutes the happiness, right? Yeah, so there's a, can you read the next slide? All right, so utilitarianism has been used a lot for theorists working in developmental studies and international security. So you read a lot of theories are based on utilitarianism. So it's important to remember what utilitarianism is talking about. And I told you that when utilitarianism was first proposed, it was very radical because it actually counts everybody equal. Like regardless of the status or the family background, everybody is equal. But it's actually, there's a bit of moral sort of doubt in a way because utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialist theory. So it judges actions solely based on the consequences, outcomes of that action. But if you think about like murder, lying, torture, we just feel that like all these actions are inherently wrong, But then, according to the consequentialist or the utilitarian theory, murder can be right if it maximizes pleasure. Yeah. There might be a case. Yeah, murder, if it maximizes the pleasure, the murder can be right, according to the utilitarianist theory. But we'll read these cases. There are a lot of cases like this. So we'll study these cases with the article that I gave you. Yeah, and then also Bentham, he rejects the concept of natural right. What is natural right? Exactly. Yeah, just because we are human beings, we're born as human beings, we're given the natural rights. It's a God-given right, but he rejects it. He basically determines all the actions based on the consequences. So he thought it was just ridiculous. Yeah, so there are a lot of cases, a lot of moral dilemmas that utilitarianism can face. And we'll talk about this in the next